Alhamdulillah.
All right, I think this is a good time to get started, inshallah. If everybody could mute themselves, and we'll start, inshallah. Dr. Auda, Bismillah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Alhamdulillah والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Welcome back. So this is an attempt to trying to apply what we have presented and discussed last time, the framework and the methodology. I have to say that I'm going to give the general framework of the framework, really. I'm not going to be able to apply, because this is the kind of research that requires researchers. I could supervise this kind of research if a good student is working on that. I'll probably need co-supervision from people who are more specialized on some of the areas that I will talk about. But this is the kind of research that we need to produce fiqh in today's time. Hence, our agenda then would have a first session of applying the Maqasid General Framework as I said, as a framework, as a research agenda, if you wish, in a general term. And then the second session will look at some of the fatwas and see if we take the Islamic law, or rather fiqh, the Islamic understanding through this framework, do we have something to add? Can we criticize what we have in terms of the approach for fatwas in the current times? It's a bit of a sensitive issue, since I am a member of these organizations that gave fatwas related to that. So I will show the European Council for Fatwa and Research our last minutes roster that we have, and I will get to some of the issues that, from my view, could improve on the fatwas that we give. Previously, we talked about basic premises and conclusions, and how the Quran is at the center of the knowledge of a believer. Basically, if you want to talk in the philosophical language, the epistemology, the ontology, the logic, the ethics, any side of philosophy, a philosophical basis that we could base our thinking over, if we're going to speak in that kind of language, then the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad ﷺ would be at the center of that. We talked about the Maqasid Framework, which I will talk about today, and try to explore some of the nodes of that framework, that comprehensive network of meanings, that web of the Quranic objectives that we discussed last time, and how this could give us a broader perspective when we study phenomena. And we're going to take the phenomena of what we have today, the COVID-19 crisis, as a phenomena, and try to apply that, as I'm saying, in a framework, not rather than just a rigorous research application, because this would be a thesis that a student would write, or a book that a group of researchers could sit down regularly and produce over a year or so. Thirdly, the methodology, which are the steps. I'll take you through some of the steps and show you some of the software that I use to search through the Quran or the Hadith and make some conclusions. And then we will talk about current scholarship and how we can improve on that. So basically, from last time when we talked about phenomena as basis for studies and action, this is what we are going to take as a basis. So basically, we are looking now at the COVID-19 phenomena. How can we deal with it? If we understand fiqh in the traditional definition, that it is the commands based on specific revealed evidences, then we are going to deal in a particular way. But if we would like to deal with all the sides of the phenomena and do serious research that has a strategic outlook and has an impact on the reality, on policy, on society, on communities, hospitals, mosques, on media and arts, and so forth, the dimensions of a phenomena is are the dimensions of human life anyway. Every aspect of human life is tied to every phenomena that we see in our world. And therefore, here, the methodological maqasid that we discussed are going to be a basis for forming a framework. And then we're going to take the methodology in a transdisciplinary way in order to describe how we deal with the phenomena. This is not just in the ilm of hadith or the science of tafsir or the science of epidemiology or any of the other sciences that we will see. This is going beyond that based on the methodology. And then if the mujtahid or the scholar is not capable of doing this him or herself, which is my case, then I would need a group of other scholars who would help in what's called al-ijtihad al-jama'i, or the collective reasoning or collective research that we can do in order for us to be able to conduct this kind of research. We looked for the methodological objectives last time in the stories and similes and creation and laws and unseen matters, messages, and so on, and asked the question, what does the revelation aim to achieve methodologically speaking, thinking-wise? And we ended up saying that the objectives are to realize the objectives, to correct the concepts, to classify groups, to align with the universal laws, and to follow values, establish proofs, and to act on commands. تحقيق المقاصد، تصحيح المفاهيم، تصنيف الفئات، مراعاة السنن، التأسي بالقيم، إقامة الحجج، والعمل بالأوامر. And these are all more or less Quranic and Quranic words, or at least the roots of them, so that we are not far from the terminology of the revelation. Therefore, the framework that we could build in order to have an outlook that is comprehensive and holistic in our approach is composed of these 7 elements and the relationships. We'll discuss some of these relationships as we talk today. Therefore, then, the methodology is about defining a question, asking an initial question for our study related to our phenomena, and then we do cycles of reflection in the Quran and Sunnah, as we discussed last time, and start to link the different elements of the framework in order to develop theories and principles. And then step 4 would be a critical discussion, like what we will do in section 2 or session 2 of our lecture today, with Islamic, non-Islamic frameworks and theories. And then perhaps we could go back and redefine the question and ask the proper questions, because oftentimes the question itself has an issue. And it's a Quranic model. It's not, yes, it's similar to many of the current systematic research models, as we discussed last time, but it's a Quranic model to correct the question before answering it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يسألونك عن الأهلة قل هي مواقيت الناس والحج. They asked the Prophet about the moon and why is the moon small and then it gets big, and what happened with the light and so forth. So the Quran corrected the question that what you need from the moon is the timings of the moon. Of course, you can do research otherwise, but sometimes you need to correct the question for the sake of the person who asks the question. So let's start with a primary question on the phenomenon. What does Islam order us to do at a time of pandemics? That could be a question that somebody asks, as if the answer to the problem is going to be, well, Islam is asking you to do this and that because the Prophet ﷺ said this and that. Maybe the Quran is talking about pandemics. Is there a word that is called al-waba or pandemic in the Quran? No? Okay, then let's go to the Sunnah and let us ask the hadith if there is the waba. There is a similar word, at-ta'un, or the plague. Let's see what the plague is telling us to do, and let us do. This is a kind of approach that does not enable Islam really to contribute to much in today's world. It might contribute to my behavior if I know that, well, if there is a plague in a city, then I should not leave the city. But if I am outside the city, I could not enter the city. A plague is a form of shahada, so martyrdom. So I think that, inshallah, those who lost their lives would be martyrs, etc. And these are all Islamic elements. But this is it. This is what we have if we ask this kind of question that is individualistic and partialistic, and we will see how, and is not really tied to the method that the Quran and Sunnah would deal with such phenomena. So how can we ask the question then? We should look into the Quran and Sunnah and do these cycles of reflection that we talked about. So this is now the methodology in a graphics form. And then we go to a level of building the framework. You can see to the left here in the middle level, the framework of the objectives, the concepts, the groups, and so forth, the commands. We're not just looking for commands that has a similar linguistic similarity as waba or ta'un, ta'ana yat'anu ta'un, waba, ba'a, maba'atan, not just the linguistic relationship, but the meaning relationship. Any meaning in the web of meanings of the revelation that is similar to what we are looking for. And then to the right here, critical studies of history and contemporary framework, which will ask some questions and open some issues. And then we can come to guiding principles and theories, or we can go back and ask better questions or more informed questions based on our research. So therefore, the cycles of reflection that we talked about last time would involve a Quranic cycle of reflection. We read the Quran to look for the objectives, concepts, groups, universal values, and so on. And then step number 9, we look at the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I mentioned last time that they are about 3,000 to 4,000 hadith, depending on whether you are going to remove the hadith that the Sahaba said without attributing them to Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly. And usually the Sahaba are not going to talk especially about particular issues of Islam without knowledge from the Prophet. So they consider these hadith, but of course it's the Sahabi or the companion's opinion in any case when they speak without the authority of the Prophet ﷺ. So therefore between 3,000 and 4,000 hadith, we could search that in the Sunnah. Again, read the mother books, we call them in Arabic, or the seminal works, collections of the Sunnah, and look at the same meanings, how they apply. And then we repeat the steps and we start to perform links. As you can see, even without the exercise, I'll show you some of that. You can see that this is quite a different approach from the approach that looks back at history, especially the history of the law, not the Quran and Sunnah. The Quran and Sunnah is not history. This is beyond history. This is the revelation, except obviously of the Prophet ﷺ's life and his events and so on that are historically bound. You know, the specific battles, the specific food, the specific currencies, and so on. But other than that, what Muhammad ﷺ said, whether it is from Allah, which is the Quran, or his hadith, this is not history. This is beyond history. After that, it's all history. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It's very important, but it's not equal to what Allah and his messenger said. And in every place and time, we have to renew the history of the understanding of fiqh. Fiqh is understanding. Wrongly translated, I guess, in English as Islamic law, appeared in a couple of my books' titles, I know, but fiqh is not really Islamic law. Fiqh is understanding of the Sharia, which is, again, not Islamic law. Sharia is an Islamic way of life. ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَى شَرِيعَةٍ. The Quran is talking about Sharia as a way of life, as a comprehensive approach to life that Muhammad ﷺ is representing here. And therefore, fiqh is our understanding of that. فَقِهَ يَفْقَهُ, again, a Quranic word, مَا لِهَؤُلَاءِ الْقَوْمِ لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ حَدِيثًا لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ. To understand and to have a deep understanding. Part of that understanding is the law. Of course, family law is part of the Islamic law. Criminal law is part of the Islamic law. But these are not only the chapters of fiqh. Fiqh is every understanding of every phenomena that we receive and meet in life. Therefore, our aim, if we're going to really form a research team and start working on this, our aim is to fill up this network here, this form, by choosing the maqasid or the objectives from the Quran that are central to our research, and then the concepts that are central, the groups, and so forth, and start to link these and start to think about principles. How can we come up with theories and principles through which we can deal with the pandemic? As I'm saying, I'm not going to be able to do that because I'm not qualified. I will need a number of people who will work together in a collective reasoning in order to do that. But we can do some of the research. If we start with the word marad, or sickness, as I'm saying, there is no waba, there is no pandemic or epidemic or plague even in the Quran, but there is the word rijz, or bala, or marad, a trial, a punishment, a sickness, or marad, illness. If we're going to do that, let me flip to a different screen here, where we look for for those who don't know Arabic, I will translate because this is in Arabic. We are putting the root of the word. The root of the word sickness or illness, marad, marada yamridu, maradan, wa idha maridtu fahuwa yashfin. And there are, as you know, 6,000, as it says here, 6,236 verses of the Quran. Of course, there are different versification between the schools of the Kufa and so on. And so the number is more or less 6,200 verses. And then we have a 1,918 Jasser, or root, Arabic root. So basically, there is the root of the word, and then there are variations. Kataba is to write, kitab is a book, maktab is an office, maktaba is a library, maktub is a message, and so on, but it's all about kataba. And kataba is to tie as well. Kataba ala nafsi rahmah, he tied mercy to himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then if you flip kataba, you find a bataka, or to sever. Kataba, which is the root of the word writing, kataba. The opposite of it would be to sever, not to tie. Alaq is to cling. Qala is to remove, and so forth. Many of the Arabic words are like that. The root itself means something, and the opposite of the root means the opposite of it. But it could be a good idea if you are going to be a researcher. Of course, you have to familiarize yourself with the Quran. If you're going to do this kind of ijtihad, you have to spend time with the book. You cannot just do searching over the roots. You have to be very familiar with the book. Otherwise, you do ijtihad or reasoning at a different level, a different stage of that research. But if you're going to deal with the revelation, you really have to deal with it in Arabic. If you're going to look for the words that mean something and the concepts. But if you have the concepts already there, you can use the English translation. If you're going to deal with the concepts that are already there and you're just looking for some of the meanings rather than the particular revealed concepts. I'm looking here at al-marad. You can see that 23, 24 ayat has the word marad. From the word marad, or sickness, you can see that the Quranic definition of sickness is not the physical sickness only. In fact, it is primarily the psychological and spiritual, and what the Quran calls heart sickness. But the heart sickness is not just what we have now as the machine, the heart as a machine, sickness in some of the veins, Allah forbid, or any of that. But no, it's the heart sickness as in the problems with the behavior, and especially with the faith to start with. في قلوبهم مرض, one of the very first verses of the Quran says that they have sickness in their heart, and they don't want to look for truth. So Allah let them increase in their sickness in their hearts. and so forth. But it also talks about whoever is sick, وَإِنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا, in the verses of Ramadan here in Surah Al-Baqarah. So 2:184 for those who want to look in the English reference. Al-Baqarah is 2 and 184. Those who are sick, and 185 is saying also those who are sick could replace the days. And then we're talking about Al-Hajj and those who are sick as well, and cannot really continue with their ihram, and then they can shave their heads, etc., etc. Talking about sickness during the time of war, and تضعوا أسلحتكم وخذوا حذركم, how to, a soldier who is sick and cannot carry the weapons and so forth. And then you have a more, as I'm saying, comprehensive instances of sickness that has to do with the sicknesses of the heart. So now we are here correcting one of our concepts, that if you are sick, God forbid, with that, this is one side of sickness, but there is a more serious side of sickness, which is the sickness of behavior, the sickness of morals, and so forth. Now, you will find that sickness is tied in the Quran to another concept, which is al-bala, or the trial from Allah. And that would be the root of bala. The previous screen was the screen that you have, marada, and then, but here, for this screen, as you can see, balawa is ibtila, or trials. That's for prophets, as well as for something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about in some of the verses as al-ifsad, al-fasad. And that is now a new concept that we are going to look at. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what are the maqasid of this? The maqasid of the marad, or the sickness, is to purify and to rely on Allah, and for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give cure. And of course, you can seek cure in the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ said, seek cure, because every sickness Allah created a cure for. So we seek the cure. And the maqsid, the objective, is to turn to Allah. The bala, the objective is to turn to Allah, but sometimes the objective is to look at your actions and see whether your actions have been collectively as humanity, whether our actions have been on the right track or not. And therefore, al-bala here is tied to al-fasad, or the corruption, that sometimes because of the corruption, then you will start to see bala. And it doesn't mean that it comes only for those who corrupt, but the bala, or the trial, when it comes because of corruption, then it becomes general. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his sunan, in his universal laws, now we talk about the universal laws, he subhanahu wa ta'ala, only in the hereafter, where every deed has a particular reaction from him subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in the dunya, it's much more complex than that, because there is a bala. For the prophets, it is a way of knowing who is faithful and who is not. For the believers, it's a way of purification and strength and patience and prayers and so on. For the disbelievers, it could be a reminder. For those who reject the truth and corrupt the earth, it could be a way of fixing their issues. For those who are no longer interested in any rectification, it could be a punishment but always Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that even if it's a punishment, it's for them, that they might have repented. Even the hypocrites at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you will see it in one of those ayat of the bala. And another alternative of bala is fitna. So if you say fatana, أولا يرون أنهم يفتنون في كل عام مرة أو مرتين, here it is in Surah At-Tawbah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the bala, or the trial, or the fitna, is for the hypocrites. Maybe they will go back, maybe they will remember, that the truth is more important than their worldly gains, and so on. But this is tied to al-fasad. So we are starting to connect the concepts and have a conceptual framework based on these objectives that we're thinking about that are different from the simplistic way of just asking, what should I do? You do this, and so forth, because we're trying to understand. And this is complex, and this could take quite some time for a researcher or for a scholar who would like to look at the Quran and Sunnah, and I'll show you also in the Sunnah what's there, in order to reflect. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about al-fasad here, as the program is saying, in 50 different places, or the corruption on earth. Earth as well is a very important concept. What do we mean by earth? When we say al-ard, that is quite a concept, and Allah is calling it Ardullah, the land of Allah, or the earth of Allah. It's a very special concept, and it's quite interesting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using that concept, al-ard. So al-fasad fil ard. So where is the room? Here it is. الروم ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. So basically Allah is saying that corruption is evident on earth because of what people have done. So you can see that from the fitrah, the original natural state, which is the fitrah, the sunnah, the universal law, is that the earth is balanced. وَأَنبَتْنَا فِيهَا مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مَوْزُونٍ. Allah has created and planted and nurtured things on earth that are balanced. But it is us who alter the balance and corrupt the balance. And therefore, we can see here that al-fasad fil barri wal bahr, or the corruption on land and sea, is happening because of what people have done. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. And here's the maqsid, or the objective, so that they might return to the truth. And therefore, it is opening, the Quran is opening more and more dimensions, if you wish, to think about when we look at sickness, and not just as an individual thing, but as a pandemic, as a bala, a big trial that hits a large number of people, and death, and so forth. And then we look at that in terms of what lessons can we learn from the Quran. I want to switch to the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, another tool for those who are familiar originally, again, with the Sunnah, but would like to find where the Sunnah is talking about that. If you say al-waba, I don't think there is al-waba in the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not a word that Allahu Akbar. Oh, it's actually there. And that's my ignorance then, and Bukhari as well. Okay, here you go. So فأخبروه أن الوباء قد وقع بأرض الشام. الوباء, or the epidemic in that sense, is actually not a new word as I thought, but it's a word that is used by the Sahaba. And here's Bukhari, the story of Umar, when he went, and the plague that happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that killed some 20,000 of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And that was part of the history of earth and the history of Islam. So that's when Umar radiallahu anhu differed with the companions. That's the hadith that we all know, that if you hear about al-waba, or إن عندي من هذا علما يقول إذا سمعتم به في أرض فلا تقدموا عليه. So it's not in the words of the Prophet ﷺ, but he is talking about the ta'un. You see, the Prophet ﷺ has used the word plague, but the Sahaba used the word al-waba, or epidemic, really, that if you see it in a land, then leave it, and so forth. But you see here that you have al-waba in 23 different places. That's if the hadith is sahih or hasan. If I remove a sahih or al-hasan here, you will find that the number is higher if this is not going to be only authentic. If you say al-ta'un, or the plague, you will find 1,200 places in the different books of hadith, the usual 14 books, if you're talking about a comprehensive encyclopedia of hadith, where there is 1,200 places where this is mentioned. But they boil down after the repetitions into like 5 or 6 hadith really that talks about the ta'un or the plague. Now, you add this or you combine this to the Quran, to what we have here in terms of al-marad, al-fasad, al-waba, al-bala, and so forth. And then we are able to gather all what is said about what we are talking about. And this is a methodological problem here that many researchers, unfortunately, and scholars suffer from, is that they bring an ayah or a hadith and they apply that without looking at the bigger picture, without looking at what we call in fiqh hadith al-bab, ayat al-bab, all the topic that you're talking about, all the hadith under that topic, all the ayat under the topic. And then you are able to form a bigger picture. Then we have a network of meaning that we can use in order to rethink our questions and perhaps propose some principles, and then have some critical discussion. I'm going to have some of that. Let me go to the question that we asked. Redefining the question then, instead of asking what does Islam order us to do in time of pandemics, then the question could be, why do we have pandemics? What is the bigger picture? And why is it a crisis when there is a pandemic? That will actually lead us to other dimensions of the pandemic. The problem with the pandemic is not just the sickness of a number of people, that is quite a large number of people, and the unfortunate death of a number of people, which is also quite a large number, but there is a much larger number of people who are, some of them dying from other from other effects and other basically consequences of that pandemic. So if we look at why is it a problem, we will start to see that it is not just the sickness and it's not even just the trial, but it will start to link us to other dimensions, such as the economic dimension, for example. Why is the economic system this way? So that people basically go hungry by the millions. In Canada, the system is quite a human-oriented system, not exactly as ideally I would love to see, but it's a much better place than many other countries, where people, after not working for a week, they start to go hungry and they start to steal and they start to have violence and issues, because after a week of not working, there is no system to sustain them. And unless there is a system of charity that some people give and some people don't give, and people who are supposed to give charity, who are the rich, are starting to lose a little bit in their business, 20%, 10%, 30% loss from the usual profit that they expect, and therefore they take the charity back. And in other countries, people start to go hungry the next day because they have to work every day. How much sense does this make? Do we really have lack of resources that much on earth? The Quran is telling us, no, there is providence for everybody. So what's going on? What's going on is a doula, is a monopoly at the top of the financial stratas. Is there rich and poor in Islam? Yes, but not rich to the extent of trillions as we see today, and not poor to the extent of hunger as we see today. Because once you go to the trillions, there is war involved, there is issues of fasad, corruption, and this is all connected, all in the Quran. I wouldn't have time to show that, but basically those who call for the war and those who are يسعون في الأرض فسادا and so forth, those who corrupt earth because of war and because of and so forth. This is Allah telling us that this is too important not to be there in the Quran as a detail. And therefore, we should look here at the other dimensions of the phenomena, the economic dimensions, the political dimensions, the social dimensions. Why is it a crisis in many homes? Just because men are back to the home and locked, that family violence is on the rise. And unfortunately, killing of spouses is on the rise, mostly women, is on the rise everywhere. In Muslim countries, unfortunately, Muslim majorities, Muslim communities as minorities, and in Europe as non-Muslim majority. And then we ask how we define medicine. Now, as we're talking about the IP of companies that are interested in developing the vaccine and so on, and again, the Canadian government giving loans and grants to universities and academia to develop is a very Islamic or Islamic compatible kind of measure, because that is an Islamic value. If you, again, go back to the hadith, I wouldn't have time, you will find that medicine is a right. The Prophet ﷺ, when there is a medicine that one of the companions needed, he would call the community to gather the resources and bring that medicine to that person, because medicine is a right. It's not a business. Yes, a doctor is paid for their skill, and it's a very high skill, but the industry itself is not an industry that the rich afford and the poor cannot afford. And that was translated in the time of our Islamic civilization at its height, when it was a leading civilization in the world. The hospitals were awqaf, were endowments. And that is the Islamic concept here of health and medicine in that sense. If you're going to connect the dots. And that is why the awqaf had sponsored al-mashafi or mustashfat or maristanat, where people go and have their health checked and their medicine given. Can we afford that economically? Of course, but it's a different economic system. It's a different system where the awqaf or the endowments or the charity organizations are the majority of the economic activity. What lessons can we learn? We can learn lessons whether through what we can change in our individual behavior and our business frameworks today, or we can learn bigger lessons for how to reshape the economy and the media and the system, how it works, because the system is not obviously working to the best of the human welfare. How do we deal with the reality? What is fiqh? What are the role of the mosques? And I will discuss that in the second session. And other systems like al-awqaf, as I mentioned, the endowments. What is the role of charity in Islam? The role of charity is to sustain civil society, really, to speak modern terms, or to sustain society and its activities. And therefore, charity is responsible for people's health, of course, with a management system that we can put and modern strategies and all of that. But we're talking about the concept here of medicine, the concept of economics and economic activity and stratas in a society, the concept of mosque. Is it a church where you just go to worship and in a crisis like this, the mosque is closed? Or is it supposed to be a center for the community where, yes, we cannot be close to each other because of the epidemic, but we can do much with the mosque as a place for the community? If this is the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ at the time of his time, he would have made the mosque the place where you find masks and you find first aid and you find volunteers. And so, alhamdulillah, many of our mosques are doing that already with the imam and the few volunteers and so on, keeping the distances and so on, but converting the mosque into a community place, because this is the definition of the mosque in the Quran and Sunnah. We have evolved mosques into a different culture that is alien to the original culture of Islam. So then, if we start to link the different phenomena, if we start to link poverty with the state and with society and the environment and so on, and we start to look at the picture holistically, then we have a research agenda that allows collective scholarship, research and action. That is what we need from an Islamic point of view, so that we can contribute through a methodology that looks at the original sources and the original systems of Islam and tries to contribute to contemporary civilization, contribute not just charity and so on and volunteering a little bit, but contributing ideas And in the industry of ideas, we have not been contributing much. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this to be part of the contribution that we should do as an ummah. And this is perhaps what I have time for this session. And then we have, inshallah, the Q&A, Dr. Nuruddin. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Jasser. So at this time, we're going to take our first installment of Q&A on what Dr. Jasser have just covered using the Maqasid methodology and framework and applying it on the pandemic. It was a beautiful demonstration, and I'm sure a lot of people are curious to get access to and put their hand on these tools. I wanted to share a question quickly before I open the floor for a verbal intervention. From Paul asked that Dr. Auda said that there are about 3,000 to 4,000 hadith. Are there any reliable online version presenting this hadith with English meaning?
The 3,000 to 4,000 hadith is the conclusion of Imam al-Suyuti when he did this research, but he did not compile the 3,000 to 4,000. It's compiled recently by a muhaddith from our time, a specialist of hadith, who is Sheikh Salih al-Shami. I have it in Arabic, and it's on the internet in Arabic. I am not sure if it's translated in English, but Salih al-Shami. And in the Maqasid Institute, we're working on that book as a resource of the hadith for the research network, and we're working on translating it, but I'm not sure if it's called Ma'alim as-Sunnah, the landmarks of Sunnah by Sheikh Salih al-Shami. So I'm not sure about the English translation. But yeah, he went through all the 14 was it 14 or 16 books of hadith? Really, Bukhari and Muslim have about 70-80% of what we have, really, in addition to many other repetitions and versions and so on. And he had a long journey of 20 years with the books of Sunnah, and he ended up with Ma'alim al-Sunnah. I recommend that you read Ma'alim al-Sunnah. But of course, there are many, many versions of different hadith that have slightly different meanings, and therefore specialists would not find Ma'alim al-Sunnah enough for everything in the Sunnah. But it gives the landmarks of the Sunnah, really, as Sheikh Saleh is saying.
Another question from Dr. Kanduz. Is there any such search system for other references written by Muslim scholars in history, philosophy, etc.?
Search for, sorry?
Is there any other search systems for other references written by Muslim scholars in history, philosophy?
You mean libraries, digital libraries of Islamic books? Wallahi, when I was interested in surveys, when I was doing my PhD back in the UK, the best library where I found Islamic sources was the SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Russell Square in London. That's where I used to sit and spend many hours. So that's where I could find lots of Islamic sources, including Islamic books. LOC as well, the Library of Congress. I haven't been there, but I've benefited a lot from the Library of Congress collection and the surveys. They don't see anything in the Muslim world, old or new, except for a copy there. I found books for some of the sheikhs I was looking for that I couldn't find even in Egypt at the time, and the Emirates and so on, where I used to teach in the libraries. And of course, Egypt used to have in Dar al-Kutub al-Masriya lots of documents, especially manuscripts. Things changed recently, but manuscripts where you find in Egypt, obviously in Cairo. Allah Alam.
Anybody have a verbal intervention that they want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Mohammed Bordi.
تفضل.
أهلا وسهلا.
Yes, I mean, we have been talking a lot about the hadith that the Prophet says that if there's a pandemic, should not go in. If you are in, don't go out. But there's no discussion about what's happened in when you are in and there is a pandemic. So, like there is like right now, there is you cannot leave the city or you cannot get to the city. But if you are in the city and there is a disease like pandemic, this confinement, I mean, there's people quarantined for like 40 days and we know that the number of people like that, like you said, they can go hungry for this period is much higher than people that can die. So for Islamic perspective, how, I mean, it was that if in that time, how would they resolve this issue of if you have a pandemic? I mean, definitely there would be no quarantine, and how you resolve this ethical question of there is a wealthy or middle class that they see a risk for themselves, but there is much risk for the poor if they go hungry because they cannot go out. So how you can take the decision and say, okay, we're not only gonna do, we're gonna let them, we're gonna do quarantine, and then you have a lot of people, like millions of, maybe billions of people suffer for hunger.
Hence the methodology, my brother. Hence the methodology, because the one hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, if you hear about the plague in a city, do not enter it, and if you are into it, do not go out of it. He ﷺ is saying this hadith in terms of his leadership, with an intent of leadership. In the Maqasid Sharia, a different lecture that I think I gave before in Calgary, there is an intent of the Prophet. That's very important. والسلام, when you look at his hadith, is the intent. Tashri'ah means that this is Sharia for every person in every place and time, or is the intent leadership? That's another major intent that scholars talked about. Or is the intent judgeship? He's judging between two people. He's not saying something for every place and time, but he's just judging between those spouses and their child in particular custody case. And therefore, in the different custody case, he might give custody to a different parent, because it's not Sharia per se, it's judgment within the Sharia. So judgeship is another intent of the Prophet ﷺ. And the intent of the dunya, the worldly affairs. I mean, he liked this, he didn't like that. He liked watermelon. Not every Muslim has to like watermelon. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. In this particular hadith, it is with the intent of leadership. The meaning of that, the implication of the intent of leadership, is that it is up to the leadership of the time and place to decide to apply the hadith or apply other things. I mean, we might have a situation where we don't apply that hadith literally, because he intended leadership in the hadith. He did not intend for this to be a matter of ibadah. The matters of ibadah are different, and they have a different circumstance and different context and different wordings. And that's why the Sahaba had this debate whether to enter the Damascus of the time or not. Some said yes, some said no. And then when they heard the Prophet ﷺ saying that, and Umar radiallahu anhu did not want for the new people to be infected and so forth. And therefore, what's inside the city, you are mentioning quarantine, helping the poor, the elderly, etc. This depends on the place and time and circumstances. We have with COVID-19, a circumstance, the elderly are more vulnerable than others, and therefore elderly homes and elderlies at your home are more vulnerable and they need particular things. The poor are more vulnerable because businesses stopped, and therefore we have to give the poor food, etc. Maybe with another pandemic, Allah forbid, if we have another pandemic in the next few years, maybe the situation will be different. Maybe the target population is not going to be necessarily the elderly or the poor. Maybe it's a different kind of group that we need to tend to in the new pandemic. Perhaps, I don't know, people with disabilities, or perhaps men versus women, or children versus middle-aged. So every place and time has its circumstances. Hence, the importance of a methodology that is general and gives a general framework, rather than looking for orders from the Kitab and Sunnah. And the commands in the Kitab and Sunnah sometimes are geography bound and history bound. I hope this answers the questions.
Jazakallah khairan. I have a question from Sister Amani. She said, Dr. Jasser, she's thanking you for the talk, and she said that in one of the interview in the past, you said that maqasid have other meanings such as justice, mercy, facilitation. How these values could become a reality in youth life so they can face the pandemic situation and the other challenges around them?
How can they become a reality is by Islamic organizations. How can the values of Islam become a reality in the communities of Muslims or in the wider community of everybody? That is through organized work. And organized work requires strategy, and strategy requires research, the kind of research we're trying to do in the Maqasid Institute. The research that looks at racism, let's say, in a particular community, analyzes it, understands it from an Islamic point of view, with an Islamic lens, not a foreign lens to Islam, a deconstructionist lens or a whatever lens that looks at this kind of phenomena. And based on the research, we suggest solutions. And then the solutions should be taken by organizations to the ground, on the ground, and strategizing and trying to change the status quo. That is how we can bring justice as an Islamic ideal to the reality. If we are saying there has to be justice between rich and poor, are we eliminating rich and poor? No, Islam does have rich and poor, but the rich has to give the poor through zakah, okay, let's take zakah. How can we institutionalize zakah? How can we make an institution that is functioning, that gives zakah? Alhamdulillah, we have relief organizations that do that. They are realizing Islam on the ground. They are realizing the mercy and the justice of Islam. But I think one very big, important, and missing institution from Islam is the endowments, al-awqaf. Al-awqaf protect Islamic organizations, because as a person who was involved in emptying Islamic organizations throughout my life, we have a problem with Islamic organizations that is the problem of funding, whether because of the politicians and their agendas, or business people and their whims and their, sometimes incapable strategizing for the community, whether through, the unsustainability of Islamic organizations is a major problem. And therefore, it's not possible for Islam to show its justice and mercy and common good unless the Islamic organizations are protected by endowments, by foundations, by nonprofits that spend on them, or charity, depending on how you are going to do that, spending on them, so that our schools are protected, our relief organizations are protected, our mosques are protected, and not to, to go into crisis mode when people stop working for a week or two.
We have a question from Muhammad Bil Yamani.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Barakallahu fik, Doctor, for the application example that you run for us. Just I want to make sure, this is methodological question, just I want to make sure, based on my understanding, following that way, approaching the concepts and looking at the question, and then prioritize the concern about the issue, and then to come up with this web of meaning in order to come up with holistic solutions, something like that. So just what is the relationship with this methodology with what we used to see and have from scholar, or the maqasid is related to some level of daruriyat, and then there is some level of necessities, kind of and the needs and kind of preferences. So how we can link that, this is systemic study about the concern of the Islam, and it's maqasidi oriented, and what we used to see in the ground coming from different scholars, that is different framework, or you need to have this level of structure in order to make your judgment how you can tackle the issues. Just I want to see your ideas there about this.
Yeah, this is maqasidi oriented because we built the objectives, concepts, values, etc., on the maqasid of the Quran. So this is point number one. Point number two, the maqasid is a framework, but it depends on your methodology, whether the methodology is maqasidi as well, or the methodology is a different methodology. We see sometimes a maqasid framework with a traditionalist methodology, in the sense of only copying from the tradition. Again, the tradition is not the Quran or Sunnah. Quran and Sunnah is out. They are revelation. They are higher than tradition. Some people copy the maqasid, but their reference, their knowledge comes from the books of history of Islamic law. And I think that this is not going to achieve what we need from Islamic scholarship at this time, to simply just copy from the imams of the past and give their proposals and authority in their own right, not with the Quran and Sunnah, in their own right. I think this is quite problematic, because this is dividing Muslims into, schools and madhahib and streams and so on, and gives an opportunity for whoever who has some agenda to ride on these madhahib in order to justify their agendas. So I think the maqasid framework has to be approached with a maqasid methodology, rather than a traditionist or historical methodology. The relationship between this kind of usul and usul al-fiqh is a long story, is quite a long lecture. I could give some other time, inshallah.
We are running out of time, because we have another segment that we want Dr. Jasser to get into on his critique of the fatwas. Is that something
yeah, we can take a few more questions, but I could critique some of the fatwas, but lightly, inshallah. It's all stuff that I said already, inshallah.
Hisham, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jasser. Jazakallah khairan for your lecture. So if we take your framework and, the group of fuqaha, for example, or specialists, or whatever you want to call them, or scholars, and they come up with this broad, as you said, holistic approach. You don't think we're going to have a problem, because, well, not problem, but we have an issue in the society that faqih is always on the corner. He's just saying salat and som and small things. Now he's going to talk about economy. He's going to talk about social. His place is going to go. Where is it in the modern state will be his, because we have a parliament, as you know, in a modern state. What is a faqih will be? Will be part of this institution, or be a think tank institution? How is his place in the modern world will be?
The one of the consequences of this methodology is the change of the definition of faqih. This is not the faqih that you are imagining as an imam in a mosque and so on is going to be an imam in the mosque. But that imam in the mosque is not the faqih that we need for the sake of research that we need to deal with pandemics, because he does not have the background that qualifies him to do that. This kind of research, if you're going to apply this methodology to the sciences of biology or political science, the sciences of economics or psychology or history in the anthropology sense, or archaeology or any of that, that requires training. And we are seeking to build a faqih who is a new kind of faqih, a faqih who is trained in a number of disciplines to the extent of transdisciplinarity, because he is trained based on a phenomena. Hence, I started with slide number 1, phenomena-based Islamic education. So we need a faqih in pandemics. We need a faqih in community dynamics. We need a faqih in poverty, and a faqih in tyranny, and a faqih in whatever it is that we have in today's world. And the faqih would be specialized according to phenomena. The kind of work that we do in the Maqasid Institute in South Africa, with the International Peace College there, we're trying to develop the programs of Islamic studies into departments of phenomena, not departments of disciplines, where in every department, a phenomena is studied through all the disciplines. Islam in Africa, let's say, it's studied linguistically, historically, it's studied through the medical field and the psychology and the genetics and the politics and the policy and so forth. The department of poverty, where poverty is studied not just as an economic phenomena, because the disciplinization is basically economics, really. But poverty is studied as a psychological state, etc. So basically, this will require a change or a development, let's say, a renewal in the approach to Islamic education, and therefore a change in the definition of faqih. Allah.
Dr. Qanduz, please go ahead. Umar and Amani, I'll come back to you.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for the information. I have a question. Are there any precedents for, let's say, a system-based approach in Muslim scholarship, history of Muslim scholarship? If not, if there are none, what does that tell us about how knowledge is approached, and doesn't that free us from the ties and all the methodological I was about to say burden, but methodological limitations, let's say, that are found in their tentatives to find knowledge and to make decisions and judgments based on Islamic values.
Yes, of course. I mean, systems approach as a terminology is in Arabic would be al-manzumat or al-nizam or al-nazm. Al-nazm as a terminology has a history because there are a number of scholars who talked about nazm al-Quran, how systematic, basically, if you want to translate in English, the word nazama yanzumu manzuma is a system. How the systemization or the connectivity, it's the same word in Arabic. An-nazm is how how a number of objects is connected to form a whole. An-nazm, if you read, for example, a number of tafasir, al-Biqa'i, al-Farahi, Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, etc., Ibn Ashur and Muhammad Abdu, a number of scholars, past and present, had talked about the nazm, Suyuti, etc., even earlier, that addressed the issue of an-nazm or the connectivity or the systemization. But if what you mean by a systems approach is the connectivity of al-maqasid wal-mafahim wal-sunan and so forth, this is from the time of the message. This is right in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and in fi'l al-sahaba radiallahu anhum. But it depends on how you read fi'l al-sahaba. Are you going to read amal al-sahabi or fi'l al-sahabi, the companions' history, as connecting the universal laws of, let's say, victory with how they organized for war and peace? They did. Umar radiallahu anhu talked a lot about the sunan, and you will find al-sunan al-ilahiyya, something in the Quran, and therefore in the language of the Sahaba. The connecting of the sunan to the maqasid and to the ahkam and so on is not new. They didn't call it systematic. We might think it's systematic because now we are speaking English, and as people who are mostly Western educated, we will hear the word systematic in a number of disciplines. But they didn't use the terminology, but they used the meaning of systematic. That is not new. Ibn Taymiyyah, in his philosophy, was not really Greek. He went beyond the Greek, and he was systematic in a number of instances and a number of theories that he presented, which could be a different lecture. But basically, the antithesis for the systematic approach is not the Quran and Sunnah, is the Greek philosophy. And what we're proposing here in the Usul al-Fiqh is to develop the Greek basis, if I may say, of Usul al-Fiqh as we know it, into a more contemporary logical basis. Because the Usul as we have it is Greek. This definition of العام والخاص والمطلق والمقيد. This is Greek. This is Aristotle, really. And I have this in some of my even old books. I have written about that. That the usul al-fiqh has developed the method of thinking. I'm not talking about the Quran and Sunnah. I'm talking about the method of thinking about the Quran and Sunnah in the madhahib al-fiqh. Is very Greek, and especially as developed later. Al-Ghazali, Imam al-Ghazali developed al-fiqh al-Shafi'i into a very Greek usul. If you read his Mustasfa, and if you read what the other schools, and is actually very influenced by the Greek logic. Logic has come a long way, and we need to develop our methodology. Allah alam.
All right, Omar wrote, if you are a Muslim healthcare worker with the current condition in hospitals and shortage in personal protective equipment, do you prioritize your health and well-being of your family, or do you continue working, putting yourself and your family at risk of infection?
SubhanAllah, this is not a question that could be answered for one answer to everybody. This is a question that really depends on your assessment of the situation. I have a number of friends who are doctors. Some of them, they themselves are high risk, and they have like major issues. So they decided not to go to the hospital because for them, it's a matter of life and death. I know one of them, a relative who is a mother of a number of children, they need her, etc. The situation made her decide to resign and stay at home because she decided that she's not going to risk it, and she is high risk health-wise. She's a doctor herself, but she's high risk. Another person who is a middle-aged, healthy person, etc., they have azima and rukhsa. They have like the higher level and the lower level. The higher level is to take a risk, and if anything happens to you, then it's shahada fi sabilillah, because you are doing your duty and you are trying to save lives. And if you are trying to save lives and you die, you're shaheed. This is the highest level. But there is a rukhsa, there is a provision for those who feel weak or they have issues. So this is not something I can give as a fatwa for every place and time. This is something that you should do istikhara and istishara, do shura, concile with your brothers and sisters and see and make a decision based on that. Allahu A'lam.
Yeah, this question came last week. And basically, those of us who are in the healthcare, if all of us decide to stay home, who's going to take care of people?
Of course not. Of course not.
Now, the health authorities are given very strict measures of safety, because the question came differently a little bit last week. The brother was asking, I believe Mustafa was asking, is this throwing yourself in a tahluka by going to work in the eye of the storm?
No, this would be shahada. This would not be tahluka, inshallah. If you have the right intention, you're doing this for Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses you for that, this would be a shahada, a martyrdom, because you are doing your duty. And as Dr. Nuruddin is saying, we cannot all do that. Some of us have to step up and take the situation. I'm just talking about a particular case where she judged for herself and for her children that she's not going to do that. But it should be the minority. Alhamdulillah, Muslims are stepping up, and it's alhamdulillah doing a much stronger message of da'wah than any other message that a guy like me in a Friday prayer could give, because you give a da'wah by being a Muslim example and by standing. I heard a British friend who was telling me it's only Muslims who are protecting us. So why are we doing Brexit, for heaven's sake? Like he was saying, we're isolating ourselves and we have violence against Muslims. And he's a British guy, an English guy. And he's telling us it's Muslims really who are stepping up. So look at this da'wah that we are giving in different countries. Alhamdulillah.
Please forgive me for the brothers and sisters who are writing, and I'm trying to diversify a little bit the questions and the speakers. Muhammad Biliyamani, go ahead.
Just I want to receive the text. Excuse me. I could receive the text, inshallah, and answer by an email or something later, inshallah, for everybody, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. تفضل.
Barakallahu. Yeah. So just I'm a little bit picky here. I want to go back to your answer about the traditional way to approach the maqasid and the new way. It's not the new way. Is both of them, they have the root kind of coming from the way the Prophet ﷺ and the companion deal with the Nas and deal with the Quran and the Sunnah. So just I want to, if I understand, and I have a question about that. It's like if I understand this, you are coming with the proposal in order to question, and this is a call to move from that approach, that traditional approach, to something more radical in order to make this qati'ah with what we used to adopt with in the traditional way, and getting stuck with this framework. Oh, where are those daruriyat, where are those stuff, where are these kulliyat, and so on. And if I understand, just I'm a little bit provoking here, but just I want to get what is the length of
no, actually no, I'm not saying to do qati'ah or to sever the ties with the tradition. Absolutely, I come from traditional perspective, but I'm just saying that the tradition is a special case of the kind of thought, Islamic thought, we need for today. Of course, I refer to the tradition I learn. I quoted here Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, and everybody. You learn, you come from the, but there is a difference between the history of the law and the law, the history of science and science, the history of geography and geography. You cannot be really a scientist without knowing the history of your science, how it developed. You cannot be a legal lawyer or a legal scholar without knowing, the Roman law and what happened and so on. So in today's time, we have to study the tradition. It's very important, and it does shape us, and we do build on it. But we have to know that it's not the end of knowledge in Islam, and there has to be in every time contemporary knowledge that we add to the tradition, because otherwise, if we only copy from the tradition, we are not going to meet the objectives of Islam. So that is the issue. I'm not calling for qati'ah or cutting this ties with the tradition, subhanAllah.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you, Doctor. I'm sorry.
Small thing. Sorry, yeah. When I refer to qati'ah, I'm talking about epistemological qati'ah. I'm not talking about no, don't use and look at it. We adopt whatever in traditional in order to come up with something that is not continuity of the same logic. It's different logic, different approach, but it's not the same. That's what I mean. That's what I want you to.
But the tradition is not epistemologically different from this proposal that I made. We have the same references, but it's just the methodology should be not changed, should be renewed, should be developed. When you renew something, when you renew your house, you don't bring the house down and then renew it. You renew it by changing some of the windows and some of the carpets, and so that's what we should do. We should renew our approach and not bring the whole thing down, because no, we have to build on our tradition. Allah.
Just a correction that the question on the healthcare that you answered, Dr. Jasser, came not from Omar, from Umar. Dr. Abir Madbouli from US, from Minnesota, I believe.
I am Abu Omar as well. My Omar is a different Omar. He's in Waterloo, but mashallah. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Mr. Mesa asking how to prepare the faqih to new phenomena, different ones evolve in different timing.
How to prepare? Well, because this is how knowledge develops. When you train the faqih based on a phenomena, you're not going to train the faqih with, let's say, COVID-19. It's a phenomenon that has a particular time. We're going to train the faqih with a phenomena that's been around forever, like the phenomena, as I'm saying, of poverty, the phenomena of governance, good governance.
Or crisis.
Or crisis in general. Yeah, exactly. So you have somebody who's trained in something that is general and generic, not a particular phenomenon. But if somebody is trained in crises, as Dr. Nordin is suggesting here, therefore that person would be capable of doing with a crisis like COVID-19, because they know the dimensions of crisis, they can deal with the different issues and so forth. That's different from a faqih who is only trained to be an imam, and that is only one speciality in Islamic scholarship, to be an imam. But the imam is not going to be able to deal with the current issues. And we have this schizophrenic personality when we come to Islam. We deal with issues in a secular way, and then we deal with Islam in the mosque. We would like to bridge that and bring Islam to real life through a framework that is generic.
Jazakallah khairan. From Omar Yewin from Washington, D.C., he's saying, Jazakallah khairan for the informative presentation. How do the various fiqh council provide leadership guidance to the Islamic communities so they can implement a more holistic strategy dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think fiqh councils could provide this leadership as they develop, or as we develop Islamic education. When we develop Islamic education more, we are creating scholars who are more capable of taking this leadership role. I'm not saying that scholars are not taking the leadership now. They are, but they are taking it based on their knowledge and their training and what they understand. I cannot assume any leadership in my community because I am trained in a particular way. And therefore, I lead them on particular questions, I answer issues. But inshallah, we would have in the future, as we develop as a community and as we develop our scholarship in Islam, in this revival of Islam that we see, inshallah, we will have all-rounded scholars who could be community leaders, really, as we had in the past. Imam Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, Ibn Taymiyyah, they were community leaders. They were not just scholars in academia sitting amongst books. When Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, Imam Al-Izz, left Cairo because the prince of the time asked him to leave Cairo. When he left Cairo, the whole Cairo went behind him, they say in history. Why? Because he was more popular even than the prince of Cairo at the time. He was a leader, not in the political sense. He did not ask for kingship or leadership or any of that, but he was a moral leader. And therefore, he lived his time. He was imamun lil-'amma, they say, an imam of the people. So far, we are imams of the masjid, imams sometimes of the university. And inshallah, as our scholarship develops, we are able to develop Islamic leadership in a better way. Islamic political parties are supposed to develop this leadership, but they also need renewal in their methodologies, because so far it's not really a different methodology from the good old Machiavellian politics. Just to be very frank and very general here. And therefore, for Islamic political parties and groups to develop, they need to develop a method, a revelation-based agenda rather than an interest-based agenda.
I know that iftar is almost there for you in the East Coast.
Yes,
one last question from
Alhamdulillah, we covered the critiques through the questions. Alhamdulillah, so inshallah.
I think that was a very good idea. Sister Amani say she read your Maqasid al-Sharia as a philosophy of Islamic law book about knowledge of Islamic medieval philosophy. I need to read about it in details. Could you please recommend one of your books so I can get more info about that?
Wallahi, I'm publishing something this year that is at the size of this systems approach book. This systems approach book has been written now like 20 years ago, so it's quite a long journey since then. I published a few smaller books between. But if you're asking for references from myself, so inshallah this year, inshallah, wait for the next book that is going to deal with what I'm talking about today in a more detailed way. But if you need more references, look at the references from the systems approach book. Look at the footnotes. I believe you have the triple IT edition. Look at the footnotes or the endnotes, wherever they put them, and look for the references. I had a few references about the Greek philosophy and their relationship with Islam that are still, to my knowledge, the best references that you can get, written by a number of other philosophers and so on, inshallah.
In this last minute we have, I want to ask a question. in the framework that you're developing and the collaboration that you're brokering with different teams and groups, how are you involving researchers in the Islamic world, both in the Arab world and the non-Arab world, and what's their engagement in this framework?
Well, so far it's localized. So far we have researchers who are trying to apply the methodology in different universities that we deal with. That is in their own universities. In the Arab world, we don't have any activity so far. The Arab world is very sensitive to new ideas, especially in Islam, or sensitive to Islam to start with. So in the Arab world, we really don't have activities as Maqasid Institute. But in a number of countries, there are researchers so far, graduate students who are really writing theses and so on. We have not been able to build the network that we're dreaming of building. And we're trying to remain independent from political and commercial agendas. And that makes you slower when you develop Islamic scholarship. It's much easier if you have a commercial or a political agenda, which we don't. So alhamdulillah, we are developing. The most advanced, I think, experience we have so far is the South African College of Islamic Studies there, where we developed a master's program on Maqasid Sharia in the Islamic Peace College in South Africa. We have in the program this year, we have about 17 students who are writing master's theses all through this methodology. And we already have about 35 graduate theses, honors and masters. Honors in the South African sense is a graduate thesis that's been written so far through a Maqasid methodology. Some are weak, some are stronger. But so far, it's in Africa, really, that the work we do through this methodology.
I mean, what's this week, as we are continuing with the series, I've been searching and looking what other people are doing, and I've seen very heavy activity in Morocco. As you know, Morocco included and brought Maqasid Sharia to the undergrad program of Sharia 30 years ago with Dr. Ahmed Raisuni's work and others. But then his students now are very prolific young people pushing the envelope, coming up with new concepts. And I think we need to create some bridges between Sharq Islami and Gharb Islami, because even there is there is no good line of communication.
Yeah. Morocco is one of the more advanced Arabic countries when it comes to Maqasid Sharia. And I'm really looking forward. I have a number of invitations actually to visit Morocco and to collaborate and so on. I'm looking forward, inshallah, perhaps post COVID. I already supervised and I'm aware of a number of my students. You mentioned Sheikh Ahmed Raisuni, Ustaduna. His daughter, Zainab al-Raisuni, Dr. Zainab, was my student actually, and she graduated from Morocco. She studied with me back in Qatar. On the issue of Maqasid Sharia, an upcoming scholar. You should get to know her and what she writes. Jazallah khair. And of course, there are a number of scholars that I could recall, other than Sheikh Raisuni, from Morocco. I mean, Ustad Farid Shukri and Ustad, a number of them. We collaborated, especially when I was directing the Maqasid Research Center in London. We had a lot of collaboration with Morocco, and it's still going on between the Maqasid Center in London and Morocco. So inshallah, there is something about Al-Andalus, Andalusia and Morocco when it comes to Maqasid Sharia. I mean, people like Shatibi and Ibn Rushd and so on, and people who have a very strong Maqasidi approach belong to that region of Andalusia and Maghrib. There is a heritage of that, and I think it has to do with the level of civilization there, because I mean, I love Al-Andalus. That's where I spend some of my time every year. In Al-Andalus, you feel from the history that civilization was so advanced that it allowed this kind of thinking. When you see where Ibn Rushd and Shatibi and Hazm and these people lived, you feel that this would require a civilization, this kind of thinking of the objectives and higher level of thinking. That doesn't work with the Bedouins. That requires al-hadara. Inshallah, we ended this note. Inshallah.
Not against Bedouins, but لأن الإسلام جانا من عند البدو.
I come originally from Arabia, so I'm talking Bedouins. I'm talking about me.
We really appreciate your time, your energy, your effort. On behalf of the whole Horizon community and all the audience from all over the world that is following us. Some are following us live and some are receiving the videos because of the difference of time. We have people following us in Saudi, in Morocco, in Germany, and other places. May Allah put this in Mizal Hasanat. And inshallah, we'll continue. We hope that you be with us in the concluding session.
I'll do my best, inshallah. Inshallah, we communicate. I check my calendar. Inshallah. And Zoom is bringing so much to our calendars. But alhamdulillah, I would be more than happy if my calendar allows, inshallah.
Allah yabarak feek. Barakallahu feek.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And Ramadan Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum. Barakallahu feek.